For today, this is our agenda. We'll be focusing on the basics of project management, but also really highlighting tools that help you do project management. You know, everywhere we look today, we see projects happening, whether it's in our work and starting a new initiative, onboarding a new colleague, even in our personal lives. You might be thinking about doing a kitchen renovation like myself, hopefully later this year. Or driving to work and seeing a new building come up. Um, all that to say, like, there's people behind that work, the project managers. So what I want you to take away, if you know, at the basic level today, is just walk away from this session realizing that it doesn't take complex or expensive or any fancy tools to do effective project management. Today, we'll be sharing how you can use common tools that you're using every day and that your colleagues are using every day to do effective project management. So I like to start off with this quote. Really kind of resonates with me and embodies project management. You know, if you don't really have a good sense of where you're going to go, it's really hard to visualize and anticipate how you're going to get there. At the end of the day, it just means you need to have a roadmap. So again, how to guide you. You know, if you're on a hike, you need to make sure you've got a map with you or an app that's sharing like how you're going to get through that hike. And then you're looking for those markers, right, that are telling you how far you're going and how far you have left to get to the top. So make sure you have that roadmap. That's a great start. So project management, really, it's just the process of making sure that you're overseeing and you're looking at implementing a project. It essentially involves these 5 steps where when you're starting, you're really thinking like big vision planning, like excited about where you're going, what are your goals, what are your objectives. Then you start getting a little bit more detailed in the planning. So looking at your timeline, how are you going to meet those goals, thinking about the people that you need to bring into the project that are going to help you achieve those goals. And then you move to executing, which to me is really the exciting part. This is where all the action happens and all the real work. And then you move into figuring out how you're making sure you're measuring like the process and the progress of your team. And this, you know, in this phase, you want to look at like metrics and things like that. And lastly, when you're wrapping up the project, you're really thinking about how you're documenting, how you're recording things, and potentially you might not be finishing the project. You know, you might be handing things off to someone else. So you want to make sure that you're kind of tying a bow on things. In this phase, it's also really important to make sure that you are communicating and closing the loop. This is really great to make sure that you've acknowledged the folks within your team and others outside of your internal team to, you know, really just thank them for their contributions and how their contributions made the project successful. So with project management, typically you have a project manager leading this process. This is someone who has this like global view on the project and the items that need to be delivered. I'm going to just note that you'll hear me say project manager or maybe use just the words PM. Often is another way to refer as project managers. So this is someone who's really like, again, looking at the goals and objectives of that project, making sure that they are met on time, thinking about ways to figure out the ways of working for the team and figure out how like monitoring the process and determining and measuring the process that you're doing and figuring out how you're going to measure for your success. So I want to start off with sharing an example of how our innovation team really wanted to reimagine our process and how we identify and scope our projects to make sure that we are like creating something and setting up our process of our ways of working. So we wanted to create, the goal was to create more structure in how we identify our projects and make sure that everybody was also like on the same page throughout that process. This kind of bubbled up when we noticed tension points and some challenges that really essentially were around like keeping everybody on the same page. So things like understanding and defining roles and responsibilities, making sure communication was clear throughout the process, and keeping everyone accountable. The solution here was really developing this project charter, which I'll talk more about, and it outlined our scope of work, our timeline, and responsibilities. If you haven't heard the term scope of work, ideally it just tells you like the boundaries of your project, what your team is doing and what another team might be doing as well to contribute to the overall project. So this was our first step, kind of just thinking how we go and put together this document. And this document, again, has these 4, I would say, like pieces that are essential or the backbone of our project charter. Some of the things I've already mentioned. So again, that goal setting, creating a timeline, resources, and measuring the success. So as we go through this presentation, I'll be sharing and highlighting tools that helped us to go through these different phases. So let's start off. When you're starting a project, you really want to identify your goals and objectives. When you're starting this process, you really want to consider a couple questions. Just understanding the description of the project itself, and thinking about the problem statement that you're trying to tackle. One thing that's really helpful is looking and kind of envisioning and imagining the end and already being there and what you want to achieve. And by starting off there, you're able to take a step back and understand the goals of how to get there. I want to also note it's really important to make sure that you are involving everyone in this process because it really brings buy-in. So you're making sure that you're talking through this with your team members, getting their input, and also any other people who are also part of this process. So for our first tool, I want to highlight Jamboard. This is an online virtual whiteboard. And we used this when we were redefining how to scope our projects and identify which project we wanted to, take on next. Projects were really kind of, coming at us in different ways, whether it's through the executive team or through other agencies that are interested in working with us. We really wanted to create and improve that process for ourselves. That was the goal, create some framework and more structure around that. We started off by using the Jamboard and doing a lot of brainstorming. And this was really helpful because the tool itself is very user-friendly. It's free, which is great. And it lets you be able to add in different participants. So you don't have to have any type of special license. And if you're working with different folks who are on their own systems or community, all they need is a Gmail account. You'll also note as I'm moving through these different examples, I'm going to highlight the tool that our innovation team used, and then also share some other tools. Because while we used some, there's a lot out there, and I've used some of these in previous projects or previous teams as well. So that was our first step. Next, once we wanted to kind of really understand and pull together our ideas and put them into patterns, really see what was coming together, we used another tool called Plectica. Again, it's an online virtual whiteboard, and this helped us to be able to refine our process, and really the result that came to be was identifying our scoping criteria. So our scoping criteria includes 7 different criteria that we typically look at when assessing whether or not we want to, select a new project. We look at things like stakeholder buy-in. We look at if there's enough space in the project for us, hoping that it's not too crowded. We look to make sure that it's a project where we can bring all our expertise. To Cam's point earlier, we have a data expert, and we have a civic design expert. So are we bringing the most value to that project? One thing I want to note is that Plectica was a tool that we were also testing out during the pandemic. And so while we don't use it today, the tool we did end up purchasing was Miro. So some of you also might be familiar with that as well. Now, once you've identified your goals and you figure out your goals and objectives, we got that down. It's time to move on to creating timelines and schedules to really figure out how you're going to achieve those goals, like in what time. So at the end of this stage, a PM should be able to really identify the bird's eye view of the entire project, but also be able to identify the very detailed or micro, week by week schedule of a project, the different activities and tasks that need to be completed, and then also the milestones and the deliverables about the things that you are going to create, whether they're products or things that are going to help those services. So again, we're going to jump into a variety of different tools that help with this process. So the Gantt chart, if you're not familiar with a Gantt chart, ideally it's just a way that you can visualize work and see it in a certain sequence and order. And you're able to use this chart to be able to plan your project, but then also use it to be able to see, like, are you actually in reality keeping up with that plan, or are you having to shift and modify that plan? The tools that we use are, Excel and sometimes even Word if it's really just a high level outline of a timeline. Again, there's other tools out there. Now, I want to break down and kind of demystify any confusion or like complexity around a Gantt chart. There's three tiers in a Gantt chart. Ideally, like your first part is just thinking about your steps or the phases of your project. So how you all approach different projects. Then you want to focus on how long will each of those phases or steps take. And lastly, you kind of start breaking down into more of the micro piece of the daily or weekly tasks that need to be accomplished. I find that doing this last step of figuring out the deliverables and the tasks that need to be accomplished really helped me to make sure that like the timing of the overall project makes sense. Couple tips too. When you're doing a Gantt chart, it's really helpful to make sure that you might be adding context to it as well. Is there other folks looking at it? And make sure that you're potentially like color coding different things so that you can distinguish the different phases. Now I'm going to move into talking about some examples of Gantt charts that we've created for our projects. So for our housing project with the I team, the goal here was to draft a high-level Gantt chart. So what you see is those tiers again here. You see at the top is our steps and phases. We use what we call a Bloomberg innovation process inspired by Bloomberg Philanthropies. We're really looking at research and then diving into co-creating some solutions, and then we move to delivery. So we kind of capture that, and then we identify the timing of those different phases. And lastly, all those different steps and things that need to be accomplished to get the project done. So again, the tool itself was pretty simple. It's Excel. Again, there's other tools that are out there, but really just simple. And a great thing too is that you can create timelines and modify them by simply duplicating and creating new tabs as well. Once you've got your high level Gantt chart to give you like that bird's eye view, next you move into creating the timeline that breaks down those different week by week activities, the tasks that different team members are doing to make sure that you're staying on schedule. Again, here we use an Excel sheet. You can see it's a whole different format, been personalized in a different way, but still sharing the same similar information. You can see week by week the different tasks that are happening. And again, we just used Excel. A couple other things to note, they're just little tips. Make sure you're including holidays and also time that your team members are taking off to really make sure that you're incorporating enough time for the work to get done and taking that into account. And lastly, reminders are really helpful to keep folks accountable. So while there are a lot of tools out there that provide a system for that, we found that's really just helpful to use our Outlook and send calendar reminders. And that's been really effective for us, making sure everyone is staying on task. Now, once you've got your timeline, understand your schedule, the tasks that need to be completed, start moving into preparing your resources. This is where you're going to look at all the things that you need to bring together to make sure that project considers all the things that you might need to financially prepare for, and also like think about time as well. So here's a snapshot of a good amount of like a suite of different resources you might think about. I'm going to call out a couple of them. One is your budget. You really want to think about the entire budget of your project, how much funds you need to set aside for the different things. You might also create different budgets for different activities as well and break those out. Team roles. This is really important because everybody on the team should really clearly understand their role and their responsibilities. It helps everyone on the team, in your internal team, and other partners and external community stakeholders to really understand how they're contributing to the project. And lastly, communication style and co-creating agreements really talks about just making sure you've set up your project in a way that everyone understands how you're going to be communicating out, when you're going to be meeting, that cadence. One thing we like to do is something we call ways of working. It's a couple of sessions that we do throughout the process, and it's really helpful at the beginning. We ask ourselves a couple of key questions so that we can understand how we like to work and how our team members like to work. So we ask things like, how do you like to be communicated with, right? Like there's teams here, people use Slack, email, phone, there's so many different ways. And so that's really helpful to know that. It's also really helpful to make sure that you talk about when you're most productive, whether it's the morning or afternoon, and set up times for your meetings that way. So that kind of just helps us understand how we're all showing up in the space and to work. So for the tool that we use to build out our budget for the digital equity project was just a basic Excel sheet. This was just an estimate that we put together to make sure that we were thinking about all the things we needed for our community outreach efforts. So what you'll notice is, the different items correspond to our community outreach strategy and then allocating how much of the resources we might need. So that might be things like, your printed materials, your flyers, surveys that you have. If you're thinking about food for the events, these are all the types of things we are thinking about. Couple tips, it's really great not only to add the total cost, but when you can add a breakdown, and that way you know that you can adjust accordingly if you need to potentially like change those and increase or decrease them. Excel is really great because you can use simple formulas that add things up for you. And again, there's other tools out there, Smartsheet and Google Sheets, and they all help you develop a budget for your project. All right, so once you've developed your budget, you understand and you got your resources and you're thinking about the ways that you're working and all those different pieces and components for resources, you're going to move into how you're going to measure success for the project. So a couple things to think about when measuring a project and its success. You want to think about how you're going to quantify that success. Often the first thing I think that pops into people's head is numbers, right? Like looking at numbers. So if we take the example from the last slide and think about our community outreach events and efforts, one way we might quantify that might be to say, we want to do 15 community outreach events. Now, on the flip side, it's really good to think about how you're also going to use qualitative ways to quantify that too. So thinking about the content of like the comments and the input and the feedback you got and how that helped inform your project recommendations or helped you with your project. So really think about those two things. Don't forget about the qualitative piece when trying to think about ways to measure your success. After the project, I also want to note it's really helpful, like I said, to record any all completed and any outstanding action items. Debrief with your team. This has been really helpful for us. This is where we take some time, we reflect on what happened, things that worked really well, things that didn't work so well, and ways we want to improve that. And this has helped us to take some nuggets and incorporate that into future projects. And lastly, close the loop with partners. No one likes to be left hanging and not knowing what happened. So make sure you're thanking everyone and that you're following up with them. So for our example regarding measuring success, we use, again, Excel. And here for our youth justice project, the goal was to create a new tracking system was gonna better identify how we establish methods for tracking the youth diversion process. So what you see here is a table with the different programs for youth diversion, the diversion programs themselves and activities, and the different years and the numbers that are there from those that the youth and their families that participated in those programs. Our data lead developed this in collaboration with the city's diversion coordinator. And this is a tool that really helped them figure out what's happening like this current year, past years, and being able to do a yearly comparison to see what types of programs are benefiting, use the most, and also benefiting the most amount of people as well. In conclusion, I just want to leave you with this quote. It really resonates with me when I think about project management because as a program project manager, you do your best to prepare, to organize, to think about all the risks and things like that. And sometimes things go according to plan and sometimes they don't, and that's okay. However, the more planning, the more setting up you do, like the things we talked about, you and your team are in a better position and better equipped to figure out how to be flexible, how to adapt, or how to do hard pivots than if you hadn't done any planning at all.